husband kept saying his ex's name in his sleep, so I invited her to our wedding. I'll never forget the exact moment I realized my fiancé was whispering another woman's name in his sleep. We'd had an exhausting day tasting wedding cakes, trying to figure out if we wanted double chocolate or salted caramel, and I was half asleep myself when I heard him murmur, "Tracy, I'm sorry." It was so clear and so unguarded that it jolted me fully awake. For a second, I thought maybe I'd misheard him, but then he sighed, turned on his side, and said it again. "Tracy," like a lost plea. My heart gave a lurch. Tracy. That was his ex-girlfriend's name. The same ex-girlfriend he'd insisted was completely out of the picture. A done deal. An ancient footnote in his life. I lay there in the dark, my pulse thrumming in my ears, thinking how ridiculous it felt to be jealous of someone who wasn't even in the room. Yet I couldn't shake that gut-twisting sense of betrayal. It took me a day or two to bring it up. Mike, my fiancé, and I were in the midst of finalizing our wedding guest list, which should have been a fun process if you don't count the typical stress of deciding who gets a +1 and who you're obligated to invite because they invited you to their wedding 4 years ago. Anyway, I was blearily making coffee on Monday morning, and I said as casually as I could, "So, you were talking in your sleep last night?" He squinted at me, still half asleep himself. "Oh yeah? That's weird. Did I say anything embarrassing?" I shrugged, wanting to see if he'd come clean, but he just frowned, waiting. Finally, I said, "Well, you said someone's name. Tracy. Twice, actually." His reaction was immediate, like a quick jolt of alarm flaring in his eyes. Then he tried to cover it with a shrug. "Huh, I don't remember that. I guess I was having some random dream. I didn't push it too hard that morning. I guess I was still clinging to the idea it was a coincidence or meaningless. Dreams are random after all, right?" But then it happened again the following week. This time, I distinctly heard him say, "Tracy, I'm so sorry," like he was begging forgiveness. My stomach knotted up even tighter. It wasn't random. It was a recurring thing. But when I told him in the morning, he shook his head like he didn't believe me or didn't want to believe me. "I'm not dreaming about her," he insisted, looking genuinely confused. "I haven't even thought of Tracy in ages. Why would I suddenly start dreaming about her?" My answer to that question was, "I don't know, Mike. You tell me." But I didn't say it out loud. Instead, I let it stew. I hoped it would resolve itself, that whatever was triggering these nighttime confessions would go away on its own. The last thing I wanted was to start a huge fight right before we got married. Wedding planning is stressful enough without the specter of an ex-girlfriend haunting your relationship. A little background. Mike and I had been together for about 3 years. We met through mutual friends at a 4th of July barbecue. He offered me a hot dog, told me a silly joke, and I remember thinking how comfortable he was to talk to, like I'd known him forever. We started dating soon after, and it was a sweet, fun romance. We moved in together after about a year, and he proposed 6 months later. I was so sure about us. Sure, I'd heard bits and pieces about Tracy, some old girlfriend from his college days. He said they'd broken up because they grew apart. There was no dramatic blowout, just a mutual decision, or so he claimed. I believed him. It sounded plausible enough. But after hearing her name slip through his lips in the dead of night, I started to wonder if maybe the story was more complicated. It got to a point where I dreaded going to bed. I know how that sounds. Dramatic. But the truth is, I'd lie awake, waiting to see if he'd start talking in his sleep. If he didn't, I'd sigh with relief. If he did, I'd lie there frozen, afraid of hearing something even more incriminating, like, "I love you, Tracy," or "Come back to me." One night I heard him whimper, I messed up, and it left me anxious for days. I felt like I was the only one carrying this burden of knowledge because he was always fast asleep when it happened, and in the morning, he'd be stubbornly oblivious or, at best, apologetic, but clueless. Finally, I confided in my best friend, Amy. Amy and I have known each other since middle school. She's the kind of person who tells it like it is and doesn't sugarcoat anything. We were in my living room, flipping through potential color schemes for the table settings, when I blurted out, "Mike keeps saying his ex's name in his sleep." Amy nearly dropped the sample swatches. She looked at me with big, startled eyes. "Hold up, what? Are you serious? That's messed up." I shrugged helplessly and told her everything, including the phrases about being sorry or messing up. She gave me a sympathetic frown. "And you're sure there's nothing going on between them now?" "He swears he hasn't talked to her in years," I said. "I even checked his phone once. Okay, that's maybe crossing a line. But I did. There was no trace of her. No texts, no calls, nothing." Amy leaned back on my couch, crossing her arms. "Then maybe it's guilt, or unresolved feelings, or both. Maybe he did something that ended their relationship badly. Just because they're not talking now doesn't mean he's not beating himself up over it internally. I considered that possibility for a moment. A part of me wanted to push it aside. Another part felt like maybe she'd struck a nerve. He always made it sound like they split on friendly terms, I said, but maybe that's not the whole story. Amy shrugged. If it's eating away at him subconsciously, maybe you need to talk it out. Find out what really happened. Over the next few days, I made multiple attempts to get Mike to open up. Each time I'd say something like, hey, let's just have an honest conversation. Are you hiding something about Tracy? And each time he'd insist, no, absolutely not, babe. But he'd look so uncomfortable, so tense. It felt like there was a huge rock sitting between us, and neither of us could climb over it. Our arguments started overshadowing everything else. When we tried to do normal wedding things like picking out the invitations or scheduling the florist, I'd catch myself snapping at him over tiny issues, and he'd snap back. We were under this ugly cloud, wondering if we were even making the right choice to marry when we couldn't communicate about something so fundamental. Eventually, out of desperation, I decided to do something a little crazy. Amy had half-joked about me messaging Tracy directly. At first I balked. Why would I drag this other woman into my drama? But the problem kept intensifying, and I felt like there was no way forward unless I knew the truth of what had happened between them. Late one night, I found Tracy's social media profile. It wasn't hard. She used her real name and photo, so I recognized her from an old picture Mike had on his phone years ago. I clicked on her page, my heart pounding. She looked nice enough. Warm smile, seemed confident, had a couple of close friends tagged in various pictures. Scrolling through her feed felt like I was spying, but I had to know. I hovered over the message button for what felt like ages. In the end, I mustered the nerve and sent her a simple greeting. Hey, Tracy. I'm Rachel. I'm Mike's fiancé. I know this might be weird, but I wanted to ask you something. Looking at that message, I felt a wave of guilt. Shouldn't I talk to Mike first? But we'd already tried that and it led nowhere. So I hit send and spent the next 24 hours in a state of total anxiety, second-guessing every word. I half expected her to ignore me or block me. To my surprise, she replied the next day, politely but somewhat guarded. Hi, Rachel. This is definitely unexpected. How can I help you? With my heart pounding, I typed out a quick explanation. I'd been hearing him mention her name in his sleep. He seemed remorseful, I was confused, etc. I tried to keep it cordial. She took a bit longer to respond, but when she did, she said she was curious why I was so concerned. She confirmed that, yes, they used to date, that it ended badly, and that she really had no contact with him anymore. Then she asked me, is there a specific reason you're worried? I almost laughed at the question. It was so obvious to me, but maybe not to her. So I told her, honestly, that I felt Mike was carrying guilt, and that I needed to know if there was something bigger he'd never told me, because it was sabotaging our relationship. It was surreal, having this conversation with a stranger who used to date my fiancé. I half expected her to accuse me of being insecure, or to tell me it was none of my business. But she was surprisingly understanding. She admitted that their breakup was more complicated than Mike had probably made it sound. She said he'd left her at a time when she really needed support, that he panicked when things got serious in her personal life. She said he never gave her a real explanation or closure, so it left a lot of raw edges. Reading that, my heart twisted. Was that what the dreams were about? His subconscious punishing him for abandoning her in a crisis? Tracy, however, made it clear she'd long since moved on. She had a different job in a different city. She wasn't carrying a torch for him. She ended her last message by saying, I'm not angry at him anymore, if that's what you're worried about. But maybe he's still angry at himself. I chewed on that sentence for hours, letting it sink into my bones. Could it be that Mike's repeated nighttime pleas, I'm sorry, I messed up, were simply his buried guilt? If so, maybe talking to her for 5 minutes in person could free him from it for good. But how on earth would that happen? The idea that sprang to mind next was so bizarre, I tried to laugh it off. Inviting Tracy to our wedding. I mean, who does that? Invites the ex-girlfriend, the same ex whose name had stirred up so much anxiety in me, to witness our vows. But the more I thought about it, the more it took hold. Maybe seeing her in the flesh, maybe apologizing properly if that was what he needed to do, would finally exorcise this ghost. It sounded insane. I let a couple of days pass, and the thought wouldn't leave me alone. Amy, being the devil's advocate she is, just said, girl, you do what you gotta do. But that's pretty nuclear. One evening, after Mike and I had one of our increasingly common half-arguments, this time about table centerpieces of all things, I told myself I'd do it. I'd invite Tracy. We needed closure. If the presence of his ex at our own wedding was enough to destroy us, then what hope did we have for marriage anyway? So I typed out a long message to Tracy, explaining that, as crazy as it might sound, I wanted her at the wedding. I told her my reasons. that I believed if he could see her, apologize, and know she forgave him, we could both move forward without fear or secrets. She probably thought I was unhinged, but she wrote back that she was open to it if it wouldn't cause more harm than good. At this point, I should have told Mike right away, but I was terrified he'd explode or say no. A big part of me wanted to see his unfiltered reaction to her appearance. So I kept it a secret. Weeks passed, and the big day loomed. My nerves were in shreds because not only did we have the usual wedding chaos, dress fittings, last-minute RSVPs, caterers messing up, but I was also harboring this massive bombshell. My fiancé's ex-girlfriend was on the guest list. Worse, he didn't find out from me. He found out from her. She texted him to confirm. It was about a week before the wedding. A quiet Monday evening. We were tidying up the kitchen when I heard his phone buzz on the counter. He picked it up, read something, and his entire expression changed. His face went pale, then a flush of anger took over. He turned to me, phone in hand with a stunned look. Why in the hell is Tracy telling me she'll see me at our wedding? I froze, spatula in hand, my heart pounding so loudly I couldn't hear anything for a second. I tried to explain, stumbling over my words. I told him everything. That she'd reached out, that I'd reached out to her, that we'd talked about the dreams, that I believed it was the only way to let go of all the guilt he'd buried. He snapped. You think blindsiding me with my ex at my own wedding is going to help? He was furious, pacing our small kitchen, ranting about betrayal and how I should have come to him first. We had the biggest fight of our entire relationship that night, hurling accusations and tears, me insisting he wasn't telling me the truth about his feelings, him claiming there were no leftover feelings. He threatened to uninvite her, but I told him it was too late. I said I needed answers, and if he refused to deal with it, I wasn't sure I could say, I do, while a part of me still suspected he was stuck in the past. We went to bed angry, him crashing on the couch, me crying in our bedroom. It was awful. Somehow, we limped through the following week. We barely spoke. I tried to call off the invitation, but Tracy texted me that she'd made travel arrangements already, and that if I wanted her to stay away, I just had to say so. Yet the same stubbornness that made me do it in the first place kept me from calling it off. A small part of me believed that if I canceled, I'd never learn the truth. So I told her to come. I didn't even mention it to Mike. We'd said enough harsh words. I was prepared to face the consequences. On the morning of the wedding, my nerves were shot. Amy kept telling me to breathe, but I felt like I was on the verge of a panic attack. My hair was done in a half-up, half-down style with little flowers pinned in, but my hands shook while I tried to fix my makeup. My mom was there, fussing over my dress. Everyone said I looked beautiful, but I could barely see myself in the mirror. All I kept thinking was, I invited the ex. What is wrong with me? The clock ticked closer to the ceremony. We were getting married at an old farmhouse turned event space, with a picturesque backyard garden. Rows of folding chairs, an archway draped in white-pink roses. It was dreamlike, exactly what I'd pictured for a spring wedding. The guests started arriving, chatting among themselves, finding their seats. I was hiding in the bridal suite, peeking out of a window, scanning the faces. That was when I saw her. Tracy had arrived, wearing a simple lilac dress, looking as though she didn't want to draw any attention to herself. My chest went tight. This was really happening. Mike was outside with his groomsmen, but from my vantage point, I could see him spot her. He froze. Even from a distance, I could see the tension in his posture. My heart hammered as I imagined what he might be feeling. Shock, anger, maybe a spark of something else. It was impossible to read from behind a pane of glass. Then I was escorted outside to begin the ceremony. The wedding march started. I tried to focus on just getting down the aisle, step by step, with my father by my side. My guests were smiling, cameras flashing, but my gaze flitted to Tracy, who stood near the back, hands clasped. I wanted to run up to her and ask if she'd spoken to Mike yet. But of course, I had to keep walking to the altar. Mike's face, as I approached, was a storm of emotion. Love, fear, anger, confusion. He clenched his jaw. My father handed me off and we took each other's hands. The officiant started speaking, but I barely absorbed the words. I just stared into his eyes, trying to read them, while the warm spring sun pressed down on us. We recited our vows, both voices trembling. If you'd been in the audience, you might have thought we were emotional from the typical wedding nerves, but we both knew it was more. We were balancing on a knife's edge, terrified that this might end in heartbreak. When it came time to say I do, I actually hesitated for a split second, an awkward hitch in my breath. Then I forced it out, fighting the panic in my chest. He said his vows too, looking like a man about to jump off a cliff. The officiant pronounced us husband and wife, and we shared a brief, uncertain kiss. Our guests applauded and started to move toward the reception area. Meanwhile, I was bracing myself for the inevitable confrontation. Sure enough, a half hour later, I saw Mike talking to Tracy under a willow tree. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but from his posture, I sensed he was apologizing. He kept glancing around as if to make sure no one was listening, but a couple of guests noticed them and started whispering. I felt a pang of regret. This was exactly the kind of drama I'd wanted to avoid, and yet I was the one who'd set it in motion. When they finished, Tracy looked subdued, almost sad, while Mike's shoulders slumped with relief or resignation. She turned to go, and I saw him grab her arm gently, exchanging a few last words. Then she nodded, patted his hand, and headed off, presumably to leave the wedding. She didn't come anywhere near me. I think she guessed I wouldn't want a big scene. But after she disappeared from sight, Mike strode toward me, his expression haunted. We found a quiet corner near the makeshift dance floor. The music was starting, and guests were forming little groups with their cocktails. My heart was in my throat as he came up to me and said, "You're right. I messed her up. She was in a bad spot and I left her when she needed me. It was a coward move, and I hated myself for it. I guess that's why she's been in my dreams." His voice cracked, and my eyes stung with tears. "Why didn't you tell me before?" I whispered. He shook his head. "Because it's humiliating. I was young, I was stupid, and I never made it right. She told me just now that she forgives me." I swallowed, wanting to ask if he still had feelings for her. But before I could speak, he added, "I don't love her, Rachel. I love you. I never stopped loving you for a second. But I guess I was terrified you'd think I was a jerk if you knew how I acted back then. So I tried to bury it. But it wouldn't stay buried. I'm sorry." His eyes filled with tears, and I realized just how much he'd been carrying. All the tension, all the nightmares. It was the weight of a past mistake that he never gave himself the chance to fix. In that moment, relief washed over me. It was like I could finally breathe. "That's all I needed," I told him, voice trembling. "The truth. I didn't care if it was messy or ugly. I just needed you to be honest." He exhaled and pulled me into a shaky hug. I buried my face in his chest, still wearing my wedding dress, tears threatening to smudge my mascara. We stood there for a long time, letting the magnitude of what had just happened settle around us. I'd never felt so emotionally exhausted in my life, but also never so hopeful. Afterward, we tried to salvage some normalcy, cutting the cake, doing a first dance, smiling for the photographer. My best friend Amy, of course, gave me a pointed look that said, "Well, at least you got your closure." But she didn't rub it in. I looked around at the guests, most of them blissfully unaware of the day's drama. They might have thought we were just typical newlyweds, a little emotional, but overall happy. And in truth, as the night wore on, I did feel lighter. Mike's shoulders seemed less tense, like he'd finally dropped a burden he'd carried for years. The biggest surprise was the sense of respect I felt for Tracy. She came, let him apologize, offered her forgiveness, and discreetly left. She didn't stir up trouble. She didn't claim anything that wasn't hers. In an odd way, I felt grateful to her. It gave me peace. The nightmares, as far as I know, stopped cold after that. Mike and I ended the night slow dancing under some twinkling string lights, our guests drifting away one by one, and I finally let myself believe our marriage could start with a clean slate. We spent our wedding night in a cozy suite at a nearby hotel. I lay awake for a bit, listening to Mike's breathing, half afraid I'd hear him mutter her name again. But he slept silently, arms around me, face relaxed. Eventually, I dozed off too, and when I woke in the morning, for the first time in weeks, my stomach wasn't knotted with anxiety. In the days and weeks that followed, we talked more openly than we ever had. He told me about how he'd failed Tracy, how she'd needed emotional support during a family crisis, and he'd basically checked out. At the time, he was scared, immature, and felt overwhelmed by her pain. Instead of staying and helping her, he bailed, and he never forgave himself for it. He confessed that when we got serious, he worried a piece of him was destined to ruin things again, that I'd discover he wasn't the perfect guy I thought he was. That fear manifested in his dreams, where he kept apologizing to Tracy for what he'd done, replaying a situation he couldn't change in waking life. I listened, I comforted him, and I told him he needed to stop letting the past define who he was now. I also reminded him, with some exasperation, that if we'd just had this conversation months ago, we could have saved ourselves a ton of stress. He agreed, but admitted it was easier said than done to talk about a past mistake you're ashamed of. A small part of me wished he'd tried harder to open up sooner, but I understood the self-loathing that can come with hurting someone who trusted you. It's not easy to air that kind of guilt. So was it insane to invite her? Probably. But in the end, it worked. I wouldn't exactly recommend it as a universal solution, but for me, it forced the truth out into the open. And once we faced it, our relationship found a new, stronger footing. I won't lie and say it was magically perfect overnight. We still had some shaky moments, some lingering resentment about how everything unfolded. But over time, we learned to communicate better. I told him if he ever had a problem, I'd rather hear the ugly truth than a convenient half-lie. He nodded, promising to be more open, to trust that our bond was strong enough to survive honesty. A few months after the wedding, I even exchanged a short email with Tracy, just to thank her for coming and to let her know that Mike was doing better now. She said she was genuinely happy for us and that she hoped he'd found peace. It's not like we became friends or anything, but it felt like a final piece of closure, a gentle shutting of that door. Now, looking back, I can say that hearing him whisper another woman's name in his sleep was the scariest thing I'd faced in our entire relationship because it shook my sense of security. It made me question if I really knew him. But sometimes the ugliest revelations pave the way to deeper intimacy if both people are willing to face the truth together. Mike and I became stronger because of this. We learned to confront the skeletons in our closets before they haunted us to the point of self-destruction. That's why if I could go back and give my past self advice, I'd say, yes, it's going to be terrifying. Yes, you'll wonder if you're ruining everything by stirring the pot. But the truth is better than sleeping next to someone whose mind is on a loop of regret. We learned that sometimes the only way to banish ghosts is to stare them in the face, even if it means inviting them to a once-in-a-lifetime event. Because if your love can't survive a little honesty, it probably can't survive the long haul. And there you have it, how my husband kept muttering his ex's name in his sleep, and how I ended up inviting her to our wedding. It was messy, it was stressful, but in the end it was exactly what we needed. I figure if our relationship could weather that kind of drama before we even said I do, then maybe we're prepared for whatever else life throws at us. Sometimes I still cringe when I think about how many nights I spent lying awake, listening for him to whisper, Tracy. But then I remind myself that we turned that nightmare into an opportunity for healing. And from where I stand now, happily married, that feels like a gift.